Some people think power means being the loudest voice in the room. They think a title, a corner office, or a set of keys to the building gives them the right to treat other people like they don't matter. My old boss believed that with his whole chest. He believed it so completely that he thought firing me 2 days before payday would be the end of my story. He was wrong. And by the time this is over, you'll understand exactly why. My name isn't important. What's important is what happened over the course of about 4 months. 4 months that started with humiliation and ended with a version of justice I never expected to get, delivered not through shouting or lawyers in expensive suits, but through something far quieter, paperwork, patience, and rules that were written down the whole time, waiting for someone to actually read them. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand why this hit me the way it did, you need to understand who I was before all of it happened. For almost 4 years, I worked as a shift supervisor at a mid-sized logistics and fulfillment warehouse on the edge of town. It wasn't glamorous work. Concrete floors, forklifts beeping in the background, the constant hum of conveyor belts, and a schedule that rotated often enough that my sleep never quite settled into a rhythm. But I was good at it. I trained new hires. I memorized which trucks needed to leave by which hour to hit contractual deadlines. I was the person people called when something broke at 2 in the morning, because I always picked up. The man who ran that warehouse was named Richard. Richard wasn't the kind of boss who screamed or threw things. If you met him at a company barbecue, you'd probably think he was a pretty normal guy, a little stiff, maybe, but polite enough. The cruelty in Richard operated differently. It was quiet, calculated. The kind of cruelty that's very hard to point to and very easy to deny, because on paper, everything always looked fine. He had a habit, one I didn't fully understand until it happened to me. Every few months, right around a bonus cycle, a quarterly payout, or some kind of large check that was about to hit an employee's account, somebody on the team would suddenly get let go. Always for some vague reason. Restructuring. Performance concerns that had never once been discussed in any meeting. The direction of the department is changing. Nobody ever seemed to get a straight answer, and nobody ever seemed to push back hard enough to get one. I notice the pattern the way you notice a leaky faucet. You hear it, you register it, and then you go back to your life because it's not your problem yet. I told myself that wouldn't be me. I was too reliable. I picked up the shifts nobody wanted. I covered for people during family emergencies without complaint. I stayed 2 hours late more times than I could count, unpaid, because I believed loyalty was a two-way street. I want to pause here and say something, because I think a lot of people who are listening to this will recognize themselves in it. I convinced myself that being useful was the same thing as being valued. Those are two very different things, and it took losing almost everything to understand the difference. The 3 weeks before everything happened were some of the hardest I'd worked in years. A co-worker on my team had gone out on sudden medical leave, and rather than bring in temporary coverage which would have cost the company more upfront, Richard asked me to absorb the extra shifts. I said yes, because that's what I did. I worked 16 extra hours 1 week, 12 the next, and almost 20 the third. I didn't complain. I logged every hour properly, the way I always did, because I am, if nothing else, a details person. That habit would end up mattering more than I could have imagined. Payday was set for a Friday. On the Wednesday before, at 4:47 in the afternoon, I remember the exact time because I glanced at the clock on the wall behind him. Out of nervous habit, Richard called me into his office. There was no warning. No prior conversation. No write-up in my file, because there had never been anything to write me up for. He slid a single printed sheet of paper across the desk toward me and said, in the same flat tone he might use to tell me the forklift needed servicing, "This isn't working out. Today's your last day." I sat there for a second, waiting for him to say more, waiting for some kind of explanation that would make the sentence make sense. It never came. I asked him why. He said, "Restructuring." I asked if there would be a severance package, a payout for my unused vacation days, anything at all. He said, without making eye contact, "HR will reach out." Then he looked back down at his monitor, as if the conversation 4 years of my life was already over for him. I was escorted out that same afternoon. A cardboard box, a badge that no longer worked at the door, and a walk past co-workers who didn't quite know what to say, because none of us had ever seen this happen to someone so suddenly, without any warning at all. I remember the specific humiliation of that walk. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet stares and awkward silence, the kind that makes you want to disappear before you even reach the parking lot. But here's what stuck with me on the drive home, more than the embarrassment, more than the shock. It was the timing. 2 days before payday. Right after 3 weeks of heavy, documented overtime. That wasn't bad luck. That was a decision. Someone had looked at a calendar, looked at a payroll cycle, and decided that firing me 2 days early was worth whatever inconvenience it caused, because it might mean my final check would be smaller, delayed, or quietly forgotten in the chaos of processing. That night, I sat in my apartment for a long time without turning on the television, without calling anyone, without doing anything except staring at the wall. I want to be honest with you about what that night actually felt like, because I think honesty matters more than making myself sound stronger than I was in that moment. I felt small. I felt disposable. 4 years of showing up, of being the person people relied on, reduced to a single sentence and a cardboard box. But somewhere around midnight, something shifted. Not a burst of anger, not a dramatic decision to get revenge, nothing that clean. It was more like a quiet, cold clarity settling over me, the kind that comes when you finally stop asking why did this happen to me and start asking what do I actually know, and what am I going to do with it? I opened my laptop. I pulled up the employee handbook I had been handed on my very first day, almost 4 years earlier, the one I had schemed once and then never opened again. I started reading it, really reading it, line by line, the way you read something when you finally understand it might matter. I found the section on termination procedures. It stated, in plain language, that any termination without documented cause required at least one prior written warning to be on file, discussed with the employee, with an opportunity to correct the issue. I thought back over 4 years. There had never been a single write-up. Not one documented conversation about performance. Nothing. I kept reading. I found the section on final pay. It referenced state labor law directly, stating that all earned wages including any accrued overtime had to be paid out within a specific, legally mandated number of days following termination. Not whenever HR gets around to it. Not sometime next cycle. A hard, specific deadline, with legal consequences attached if a company missed it. I didn't stop there. I opened a new tab and searched for my state's actual labor board website. I read through their information on final paycheck violations. What I found changed the entire shape of what I was dealing with. If an employer failed to pay final wages within the required window, the law allowed for penalties, daily fines that would begin accumulating against the company, payable directly to the employee, for every day the payment was late beyond the deadline. These weren't vague, theoretical consequences. They were specific, calculable, and they came straight out of the company's pocket, not mine. For the first time since I'd walked out of that building with the cardboard box, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt something closer to focus. I want to be clear about something, because I think it's an important distinction. I didn't spend that night plotting some elaborate scheme to destroy Richard's life. That's not what this became. What I did was much simpler, and honestly, much more boring than the version of the story you might be imagining. I got organized. Over the next 2 days, I built a file. Not a metaphorical file, an actual, physical folder, alongside a digital one, containing every piece of evidence I could gather. I pulled my time clock records showing every overtime hour I had worked over the previous 3 weeks. I took screenshots of the internal scheduling software showing who had assigned those shifts to me, and when. I gathered copies of emails going back over a year, including performance check-ins where Richard himself had praised my reliability, my leadership on the floor, my willingness to step up during emergencies. One email in particular stood out. 6 weeks before I was let go, Richard had sent a company-wide email after a particularly difficult shipping deadline, specifically naming me as the most dependable supervisor on the floor for organizing coverage during a supply chain disruption. 6 weeks. That email, sitting quietly in my inbox, was about to become one of the most important pieces of paper in my entire case. I called the labor board directly. I didn't rant, I didn't accuse anyone of anything dramatic, I simply asked a factual question. What happens, procedurally, if an employer fails to issue a final paycheck within the legally required window, including owed overtime? The representative I spoke to walked me through exactly how a complaint would be filed, what documentation I would need, and confirmed what I had already read: penalties would begin accruing daily against the employer until the wages were paid in full. Then I did the thing that I think, looking back, mattered more than almost anything else in this entire story. I didn't call Richard. I didn't show up at the warehouse demanding to speak to him. I didn't post anything online venting about what had happened, even though a part of me desperately wanted to. Instead, I sat down and wrote one calm, factual email to the company's HR department. I copied nothing dramatic, no accusations, no insults, no emotional language at all. Just dates. Just numbers. Just a direct, professional question: given the termination date and the applicable state labor law regarding final wage payments, when could I expect to receive my final paycheck, including all recorded overtime hours? And then, almost as an afterthought, though it was anything but an afterthought, I copied the Regional Labor Board's General Complaints email address directly on that same message. I want you to sit with that moment for a second, because I think it's the actual turning point of this whole story, even though nothing dramatic happened on the surface. No confrontation. No raised voices. Just one calm email, sent at 9:14 in the morning, with 2 sentences of context and a single carbon copy that changed everything. The silence afterward was almost unbearable. I spent that first day refreshing my inbox more times than I'd like to admit, half expecting nothing to happen at all, half expecting Richard to call me and try to talk his way around it the way he always talked his way around everything at the warehouse. Instead, 18 hours later, I got a response not from Richard, but from someone in corporate HR I had never spoken to before, someone clearly several levels above the warehouse floor. The tone of that email was different from anything I'd ever received from that company. It was careful. Formal. A little too polite, in the way people get polite when they suddenly realize they might have a real problem on their hands. Suddenly, restructuring was never mentioned again. Suddenly, there was an offer on the table, not just my full final paycheck, calculated correctly with every single overtime hour included, but an additional payment described only as resolution for administrative discrepancies in termination documentation. I understood exactly what that meant, even though nobody would say it directly. They knew there had been no written warning on file. They knew the termination hadn't followed their own documented process. And they very clearly did not want this going any further than a quiet internal resolution. I didn't gloat. I didn't send back a triumphant reply listing everything Richard had done wrong. I simply confirmed, in writing, that I expected the payment to be issued within the time frame required by law, and I thanked them for their prompt attention to the matter. Professional. Measured. Final. About 3 weeks later, through a former co-worker I still kept in touch with, I found out something that reframed the entire situation for me. This wasn't the first time Richard had done this. It turned out he had used almost the exact same pattern, quiet firings time just before major payout periods, on at least 3 other employees over the previous 2 years. None of them had known enough about their rights to push back the way I had. One had simply accepted a smaller check without question, assuming that was just how the system worked. Another had been too exhausted, dealing with a family situation at the time, to have the energy to fight it. I was, as far as I could tell, the first person who had actually read the handbook closely enough, and known enough about labor law, to make it a real problem for him. About 3 months after I left that warehouse, my former co-worker told me Richard was no longer in a supervisory role there. I don't know every detail of what happened internally. Corporate investigations rarely become public knowledge to former employees, but I know enough. The very system he assumed protected him, the fine print he assumed nobody would ever bother to read, became the exact thing that ended his position of power. I ended up landing on my feet, eventually, in a role at a different company that actually valued the kind of reliability I'd spent 4 years giving away for free. But that's not really the point of this story, and I don't want to pretend the ending is about a promotion or a bigger paycheck somewhere else. That's not what this was actually about for me. What this was about, at its core, was the moment I stopped assuming that people in positions of power automatically follow their own rules. For years, I operated on a quiet, unspoken assumption that if a company wrote something down in a handbook, if a state passed a law protecting workers, those things existed as some kind of automatic safety net that would simply activate on their own whenever they were needed. That's not how it works. Rules and laws only protect you if you know they exist, and if you're willing to actually use them. Most people who abuse a position of power are counting on exactly one thing, that the person on the other end of that power won't bother to check the fine print. They're counting on exhaustion. They're counting on people being too intimidated, too unsure of themselves, or simply too unaware of their own rights to ever push back. Richard wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't particularly clever. He was just a man who had gotten away with the same quiet trick 3 times before, because nobody had ever bothered to read past page 1 of the employee handbook. I think about that Wednesday afternoon a lot, the version of me sitting in that office, hearing this isn't working out, walking out past my own team with a cardboard box under my arm. For a long time afterward, I thought about that moment as the worst day of my professional life. I understand it differently now. That day wasn't the end of anything. It was the moment I finally started paying attention. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this: read the handbook they hand you on day 1, even if it feels boring, even if you're sure you'll never need it. Learn the basic labor laws that apply in your state, because they exist specifically to protect people in moments exactly like this one. Keep your emails. Keep your time records. Keep documentation of the good work you do, not because you're planning for a fight, but because you never know when quiet, boring paperwork will become the only thing standing between you and being taken advantage of. The loudest person in the room isn't always the most powerful one. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one quietly holding the paperwork, staying calm, and knowing exactly what they're entitled to. That's my story. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no viral scene in a parking lot. Just the truth, the law, and a paper trail Richard never once imagined I'd have. He thought a cardboard box and a locked badge reader would be the end of it. Instead, it was only the beginning of him finally having to follow the same rules he'd been quietly breaking for years. If this story meant something to you, let me know in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more where this came from. Until next time, know your worth, know your rights, and never assume the people in charge are following their own rules unless you've actually checked.